So hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which looks at Denmark's approach to reforming food and farming policy and asks whether they're leading the way. I'm Alta Smith, and I'm joining you from South Wales. My background is in food systems and food policy, and I'm part of the team here at Root and Reason, formerly the AFN network, and I'll be your host today. We've got a really great program lined up for you in the coming months, so do look out for those announcements and please do sign up. All of our past 38 webinars are available on our YouTube channel if you want to see what we've been up to over the last few years. And while we're at it, I want to highlight that today's our inaugural webinar as Root and Reason, the Food Resilience Collective. We're excited to share the news that we're carrying on the work of AFN as a community interest company, grounded in readiness, accountability, and justice. And while some things have changed, we're still very much a community of over 3,000 people from across the UK food system who are working together to make it healthier, more resilient, just, and sustainable. And we'd love you to be a part of it. So if you haven't already, please sign up to become a member yourself. We'll put a link in the chat. So today, we are absolutely delighted to have Neil Ward chairing our conversation about Denmark's ambitious approach to reforming food and farming policy, with Simone Højte and discussion by David Baldock. Neil is Root and Reason co-founder and director and professor of rural and regional development at the University of East Anglia, and he's the author of Net Zero, Food and Farming, Climate Change and the UK Agri-Food System. So with great pleasure, I'm going to hand over to you, Neil, to say a little bit more about today's topic and to introduce our speaker and discussant.
Okay, thanks, Alta. Can you hear me okay? Yep. So welcome everybody. We thought we needed to do a webinar on Denmark because interesting things seem to be happening there. And so we're very lucky to have Simone with us. Simone is a senior consultant in the food division at CONCITO, which is Denmark's leading green think tank. Her work focuses on sustainable food systems and climate policy, with particular expertise in aligning food and farming with Danish, EU, and global sustainability goals. She's been closely involved in analysing the Green Tripartite Agreement and Denmark's approach to reducing agricultural emissions, and she brings extensive experience engaging with EU policy processes on agri-food system transformation. So she's kindly agreed to come and share her thoughts and experience with us. And we've asked David Baldock to act as a sort of discussant at the end, and he's going to say a few words in response to what Simone has got to say. And David is a senior fellow at the Institute for European Environmental Policy, IEEP, who I think this week have been celebrating their 50th anniversary. And he's been working at IEEP since the mid-1980s and served as director from 1998. His background is in philosophy and economics, and he's a long-standing and well-known authority on European agricultural policy and the environment, and has written extensively on UK farming policy since Brexit. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Simone, and if we can take down the background picture, and then Simone can share her slides. And Simone's going to talk for about 25 minutes or so, then we'll turn to David, and then we'll open it up to questions. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Neil, and I hope you see my screen and can hear me. And I'm here in Copenhagen. I'm part of CONCITO, which is a think tank working with climate and green transition. Thank you so much for having me today, and congratulations with your new platform. It sounds very relevant and needed in this time. So I'm going to talk about Denmark's approach to reforming food and farming policy, and then I think we can discuss together whether Denmark is leading the way. This is what I briefly want to talk about today. First, give a few background informations about the agriculture sector in Denmark, then present the tripartite agreement with what it is about, how it came about, some of the different important elements, then go a bit into the enabling conditions, which is some of the reasons why it could happen here in Denmark, and then some of my own reflections on what is missing from this deal. which we can also discuss further. Yeah, but first, a bit about the emissions coming from all sectors of Denmark and the role of the agriculture sector. I bring here a graph with both the historical emissions and the projected emissions. And this projection is from 2023, which is just a year before the tripartite agreement. And this is kind of the picture why the agreement was necessary, because as you see, the different economic sectors in Denmark are most of them coming down gradually towards 2035, but we see agriculture maintaining the same share of emissions and no developments really driving a reduction in emissions. And by 2035, agriculture would make up around 60% of remaining emissions. So this was a bit of the kind of background why the agreement was made. Looking at the different sources of greenhouse gas emissions coming from the sector by 2035, it is still projected that will be quite a significant amount of dairy production, therefore methane emissions coming from enteric fermentation and manure handling, also quite a big pig production in Denmark continue in the future with methane emissions from manure, then emissions from field management and fertilizer application, both organic and inorganic, take up a large share, and then production on organic soils also take up a large share. Then of course we have forestry that compensate a bit, but this was the emissions from the sector. And then when we compare with the rest of the industry and the agriculture sector emissions relative to its share of economy, you can see here also some of the, I could call it maybe motivation why it was necessary to look at the emissions from agriculture. In terms of wealth, the rest of the industry contribute with 22%, while agriculture was 2%, and the overall employment, where we have a relatively small employment within the agriculture sector, but larger within the rest of the industry. Share of export is also relatively larger in the industry compared to the agriculture sector, even though we have a very large exports from the agriculture sector. And then when you look at emissions, the industry account for 19%, while agriculture 46%. So there is some economic reasons to look into solutions for how to drive emission reductions. And there's been quite significant structural developments within the agriculture sector since 1990. Here you see on the left the number of full-time farmers in the green line decreasing significantly up until 2020, while at the same time the full-time farmers that are there, they have a larger and larger area to farm. And on the right, you see the share of total employment and share of value added in percentages, and you see that the agriculture sector has been decreasing compared to the rest of economy. So quite some significant structural changes within the sector itself. Then going into the concrete policy history for the tripartite agreement, I want to talk about now. And it started in 2019. We had what many terms as a climate election, and the politicians was then, after the election, updating our national climate law. And there was a political mandate at that time to have a 70% reduction by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. And then we had an agriculture agreement again in 2021. It was basically about how we were going to implement the common agriculture policy and at the same time drive a green transition within the agriculture sector. But this agreement presented a climate target for the sector, but not so many policies that would make sure that emissions were actually coming down. Then in 2022, there was a political agreement on green taxation reform, which introduced a new and more ambitious pricing of emissions from other industries. And that came on top of the emission trading prices that we have in the EU, so a national tax on top of that. And based on that, it was then decided that we also needed to introduce an economic incentive for the agriculture sector to reduce emissions. And that was where the tripartite agreement was made, and then also expanded to include a lot of other areas within agriculture and food. Yeah, and I wanted to give you this very brief overview of what the deal is about. Of course, it is this CO2 tax, and there is actually two CO2 taxes as part of the agreement. There is one targeting the emissions coming from livestock production, which means the methane emissions, and then there's one tax on the drained peatlands. So that's the strong, taxation elements. Then we have a new approach to nitrogen regulation as part of this agreement, which is emission-based. I will also shortly describe how it is set out to work. Then there is a green land fund with quite a large amount of money, public funds allocated to set aside 15% of agriculture land to take out of intensive production and either re-wet for wetlands, forestry, or other nature purposes. And then there's also support for carbon sequestration, reducing N2O emissions from fields, to produce and develop plant-based food, and also to support just transition. Yes, and now we're going a bit into, the actors that took part in the deal, because there was first actually an expert group that came with three overall models of how to introduce this tax. None of them looked like it was gonna be really easy, and then it was suggested to put together a dialogue platform with different important stakeholders for this transition and plan. The Agriculture and Food Council represents the farmers and food industry. First, they were a bit reluctant to go into the conversation as they did not support the idea of having a tax on the emissions from agriculture, but in the end they decided to take part in the conversation and in the negotiation, as they believed they would gain more from being part than to stand on the outside of that conversation. And the national government made the platform available as they put in their government agreement that they wanted to introduce this tax. So everybody kind of knew that it was coming. It was just about how to do it, really. So also the Danish Society for Nature Conservation took part in the dialogues, and the Confederation of Danish Industry, labor unions, the ones working within the agriculture sector or in the side streams, the local governments, which is the municipalities, and then CONCITO, the think tank that I'm part of, participated as a knowledge partner, but did not take part in the negotiation processes. The process for this agreement was quite long, and sometimes it looked like they were not going to find an agreement, but in the end they managed. And then a political agreement needed to come on top of that, so it could be decided in Parliament. And the Parliament, upon the decision, that was then created a whole ministry, which is in Danish called the Ministry of the Tripartite Agreement, which is a ministry only for implementing this this agreement. So yeah, there was quite high political buy-in to also make to implement the deal. What they decided also was that we needed to have local tripartite agreements, and the tripartite agreement should be made in water catchment areas. And this was because nitrogen pollution and leakage to the water environment became a central part of the conversation. So these 23 local tripartites should also talk together between farmers and nature organizations and find areas where and places how to convert agricultural land into something else. And these actually all handed in conversion plans this January 2026. So now they are to actually start implementing where to take out this land that they already have identified that could be taken out of production. This is some of the possible consequences in terms of, especially for the CO2 tax on livestock. To explain, it's gradually introduced, so it's starting in 2030, and then it will increase in 2035. The marginal rate is 40 tons of CO2. But there is a rebate, which means it's farmers have to pay less. They only have to pay 16 by 2030. This then increases to 100, but effectively only 40. And this rebate is made to make an incentive for the farmers to actually implement technologies and practices that can reduce their emissions. For reducing of the nitrogen oxides from fields, the idea and the plan in the deal is to have to use cap subsidies to reduce the application of fertilizers, and that should be done from 2028. So this is the estimate from the Ministry of Finance of what the deal will means in terms of both emissions and production. And it is the hope and the plan that the deal should reduce emissions with 1.8 million tons of CO2 by 2030 at least, and 3.3 million by 2035. Some of it, and you see just next to these numbers, that will be driven by structural changes, which means reducing production, but quite a bit of it will also be driven by development and technological improvements within the sector. And you see that the structural effects are decreasing from 2030 to 2035. They have also estimated that prices for agriculture products like food will very slightly increase, but it should enable that we actually reach our national 2030 climate target, and then some EU legislation, the one that's called effort sharing regulation, where Denmark has a high target, and the land use change target that is also an EU legislation. Then there is some funding for this carbon sequestration via pyrolysis and biochar, which should contribute to reaching the climate target in 2030 as well. Yes, that was about the climate tax. Now I'm moving into this nitrogen regulation that became part of the deal. And just to explain why this happened, it was because the nature organization said we need to look at all the challenges that we have around agriculture production, and nitrogen pollution was quite is quite a big challenge in Denmark. So today we have a system that regulates nitrogen on the input per farm on farm level. But the new system has kind of two parallel tracks. One is the land conversion, where we would, with the 23 local tripartite agreement, have identified the most nitrogen sensitive lands that leach the most nitrogen into the water environment. These lands should be converted from intensive production to either extensive production or forestry or wetlands or nature. And this will result in a reduced area that is production, with production. But as this will take time to make this land conversion, we are going to have at the same time this catchment based field regulation, which means in each water catchment areas there will be limits on quotas on how much nitrogen leakage that is allowed. These quotas can then be traded by farmers. One interesting side note is that, for example, organic farmers will get some more quotas as they don't use as much fertilizer. And they actually didn't want to have these free quotas because they say this is actually the advantage of having organic agriculture. But anyhow, that was actually made the deal that they will also have quotas that they can sell within a catchment area to then reach how much to stay within the limit of what the catchment area can actually tolerate. And then farmers will have to adapt the crops, fertilizer application, and production of what the catchment area can actually carry. Yes. Then there was also this support for developing plant-based food. In Denmark, we have a plant-based food grant that existed since 2021, but then the tripartite agreement brings additional funding into the grant, and it is supposed to stimulate increased demand for plant-based food. It will also stimulate supply and help support new supply streams, and then build sectoral bridges for development of plant-based food. Just gonna look how much time I have. Still have a bit, so that's good. There is a just transition element within the tripartite agreement because 13.4 million euros is allocated for re-education and upskilling of farmers and farm workers that needs to transition with this structural changes that's going to happen with this agreement into some new employment pathways. And what was identified within the deal itself is that forestry and nature management will become new employment opportunities, working with plant-based food production, with green technologies and pyrolysis, and construction and local green jobs. So that is also part of the deal to help the workforce transition as well. Then a bit about the enabling conditions. There is quite a lot of public money behind it. Like I'm to the right, you can see is 5.4 billion euros within a long time frame from 2024 to 2040. But it's since Denmark had have positive growth in GDP since 2021, there was enough public finance and political will to spend the public money to support this deal. And then the public growth is driven a lot in Denmark, especially in 2024, by the big company called Novo Nordisk, which produce medicine. And they have a foundation that then decided to allocate 1.3 billion euros on top of the national funding to help support this land conversion, especially with between 2025 and 2035. Within the economy, within the agriculture sector, was also in a good, striving, as the operating profit has been quite positive since 2029. So the farmers and the farming sector also had enough economic wealth to adapt to this introduction of a CO2 tax. Then just to mention a few other enabling conditions, Denmark has a long cultural history for collective bargaining agreements within the labor market. Similarly, where actors come together and negotiate, and then has previously been a front runner on nitrogen management within agriculture and introducing legislation. So because of this, it was also more easy to go into these negotiations and make a deal. Then coming into what could be missing within this agreement, from my perspective and from CONCITO, it is an agreement about change in land use, but the agreement hasn't taken into account all the relevant land use issues that are important. We see that biodiversity is not directly included, and could be further included. So the areas that will be taken out could be really supporting improvements in biodiversity. Recreational spaces close to where people are living could be further included in the plans for conversion, so they can create high value spaces, especially for rural areas. Then climate adaptation, how to handle the changing climate conditions in Denmark, where we need to handle water in a different way, especially could have been taken more into account. And then protection of drinking water. It's been a big topic during the election we had just a month ago on how do we protect drinking water from pesticides, residues, and nitrate. And this would also require that some areas are not farmed in a particular way with pesticides. So that would have been, that's an important land use issue as well. Animal welfare was not part of the deal, and again, during the last election, that it was actually called the pig election, because there was so much focus on improving animal welfare for pig production, and this has not been taken into account in the deal. So then probably need some other political instruments to work on that. Then healthy diets and local food strategies was not included either. There is support for development of plant-based food and trying to increase demand, but working with how to enable that healthy food become more available was not a central point in this deal, and could be worked on more, and introduced in the future. So these were my this was my presentation, and I'm very eager to hear whether you think we're that Denmark is leading the way, and I think we can have a good discussion on what can be learned from this case, and what is maybe difficult to transfer to other other countries and regions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Simone. That's fascinating. So before I move over to David, I just want to remind all the participants that please do have a think about questions. Put any questions that you have for Simone in the Q&A section, and we leave the chat for just sort of comment, and we'll draw out the questions from the Q&A section and put them to Simone. But first, let's hear from David. David, you've spent a long time doing comparative work and studying agriculture and environment across Europe, and been thinking about the UK scene post-Brexit. What do you make of this?
Thanks, Neil, and thanks, Simone. Every time I hear about the Danish experience, and I've been to Denmark a couple of times, I learn something new and something interesting, and I'm not sure I've absorbed it properly yet. first thing for me to say is that Denmark is exceptional within Europe. Part of the deal, which Simone didn't mention, but the government, the Danish government, did make an offer to try to promote um, um, some level of ambition in other member states, ideally emissions trading in for agriculture sector, and they have done that. So they've actually been promoting it quite actively within the EU. But we're not expecting at the moment the Commission to propose ETS, not in the short run anyway. And so Denmark is absolutely, in my view, a leader in terms of a negotiated cross-cutting approach, both to emissions reduction and food and land use change at the same time. And the land use change component is quite large in the proposal and often doesn't quite get noticed to the extent that the emissions reduction does. I think it's also worth noting that Denmark has not been inhibited by some of the things you would expect it to be inhibited by. It's not really been inhibited by carbon leakage. It's not really been inhibited by fears about food price increases, 1% estimate you mentioned, Simone. It's not really been inhibited by fears about food production reductions. And I think there are some, and Simone might want to say some more about that, for example, the pig sector, but that hasn't actually held the country back. And it would be interesting if the UK or bits of the UK, we were talking about mostly devolved competences here, were to go down a path like this. The UK, of course, would not be constrained by membership of the EU and what goes with that. So actually, the UK would be quite free to devise its own approaches if it wanted to. I think a couple of reflections on what it shows to us. And the first one is that it is possible to adopt an integrated cross-cutting approach and to negotiate that successfully with the leading stakeholders. And not only the farm groups here, it's significant to me that the Danish industry groups are heavily involved in the negotiations, and not only the agri-food industry, but to some extent also other industry groups, labor unions, who have an interest in agriculture doing its share in emission reductions, because if agriculture doesn't deliver, then other sectors of the economy are going to have to. Now, Denmark has a higher proportion of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture than the UK. Denmark and Ireland are considerably above the EU average. But on the other hand, we seem to be, at the moment in the UK, adopting almost the opposite strategy of rather ignoring greenhouse gas emissions and in terms of their likely magnitude, let's say by the seventh carbon budget. And rather than starting to plot out how they're going to be addressed as other parts of the economy reduce their emissions, as the Climate Change Committee keeps mentioning, agriculture has been rather lagging behind. I think it's also worth us reflecting on the fact that as well as enabling conditions, which Simone mentioned, some of which obviously don't apply in the UK. I mean, the most startling one is perhaps the political consensus, which is underlaying the whole exercise, and including a willingness to sort of take on farmers politically by the political parties, and a perception perhaps in Denmark more than the UK that farmers are polluters as well as food producers. It's interesting that the whole Danish model has made heavy use of first of all, binding targets, a regulatory approach. It's not just funded. Secondly, there's been a lot of quantification, and that's helped to bring people to the table, informed basis for negotiation. And that's economic quantification, environmental quantification, income quantification. So there's a lot of economic analysis behind the approach, as well as looking at the actual environmental outcomes and impacts on food production. And a willingness to include a credible plant-based food diet, food component inside the project, alongside measures which are mostly bearing down on the livestock industry. So that, I think, is also quite important. And then a couple of final reflections. Governance will be a very, very interesting experience for the rest of Europe to look at. I mean, already the negotiated agreement is a fascinating example of how one can negotiate change, particularly. But then the land use component also requires negotiated changes in catchment by catchment level, as Simone said, all through Denmark. And it is catchment organized, as I understand it. You might want to correct me there. So that does require considerable amount of underlying initiative and organization, and some level of consensus at a local level as well. So if we think in the UK, well, we're at the start, perhaps, of a process of imagining how some rather similar issues are going to be addressed, whether it's emission reductions, nitrate pollution. Often we don't talk quite enough about that in the UK. Peatland restoration, which is important in Denmark, tree planting, biodiversity. All these factors are not entirely dissimilar in certain parts of the UK anyway. Are we thinking, as we approach issues like the roadmap for agriculture in England, the 7th carbon budget, the consequences of the English land use framework, etc., are we being really bold enough in imagining how we could actually tackle multiple issues at once and get the stakeholders around the table to be talking about this and equip them with the right kind of backup material in advance?
Great, thank you, David. That's helped think about the implications of what Simone's had to say for us in the UK. Simone, we've got more than 20 questions. If you want to respond to anything that David has said, do that in your answer to the first one. But what some of them overlap, and so there's several that people are quite interested in. How was it that the agricultural interests were brought on board? There are several questions about this, and I think that's coming from a British perspective. Of this would look very difficult to do, given the sort of state of agricultural politics in the UK. So, could you say a little bit more about how they were brought on board, and perhaps linked to that, there's a question from Star about the overall sort of financial package. Is it costing more to run this policy? Is it neutral, or are there savings? And that might be part of the answer for how the agricultural interests were brought on board. So how are they brought on board, and what's the sort of bottom line in terms of whether it costs more or less?
Yeah, thank you for these questions. And yeah, I do understand that it's difficult to imagine in a way how it came about, especially with agriculture interest. I think there's a kind of two answers to the agriculture interest. One, as you saw, employment within the agriculture sector is only 3%. And if you only take the full-time farmers, they are not enough to even give one politician a mandate in parliament. There is actually quite few that are directly involved with agriculture and farming. So in a way, they were like the agriculture sector was kind of forced to get into this. There was a political mandate saying we want climate action from the agriculture sector, and the sector themselves were standing a bit on their tiptoes, like, should we resist, stand on the outside and just say no, protest, or should we step into the room and take part in negotiation, influence the process, then they could. That's what they ended up doing, with the belief that they could gain more from being part of the conversation than standing on the outside. So, and I think it was also quite visible in the politics, because we used to have one farmer party, that would have like the main interest of farmers, but that party actually split into three. One that was then more focused on farmers. The old one that tried a bit, oh, we both want to still be relevant for farmers, but also for people living in the cities. And then one that was focusing more on other businesses and not so much on the farming sector. So I think like the constituency from is not that strong for kind of agriculture and farm voters. So in a way they're cornered to get into this kind of deal. And then, as I said, there is significant public finance being allocated as compensation for farmers as well, as part of this deal, so that there is afforestation schemes to buy up land. A lot of also the common agriculture policy is used. There is these eco schemes that are supporting also the extensification of areas that are either with peatlands or nitrogen sensitive. So all of these public finances is, I think, what also makes the farming sector interested. The investment into development of new products within this plant-based food schemes is a business opportunity. They see like, okay, there is some kind of growth path still for us. We just need a transition plan here. Like we need money to transition, and we need a direction as well. And part of the agreement was actually also to set up a growth committee, agriculture growth committee. They haven't come with their conclusions yet. They were just about to, but then the election was called, because the sector themselves insisted on this is a development potential and not just a reduction and reducing production plan. And I think what we are going to see in the next policy cycle is also more of this. What do we put instead? Also for rural areas, like how can we create job opportunities, maybe not directly linked to agriculture, but to other other economic opportunities. And there it's a bit interesting to see that in the EU, the agriculture policy is moving into these national and regional partnership plans. That is the proposal for the next CAP, and I think it has some good opportunities to align with where we are in Denmark, where we need to see more integrated on the rural economies.
Great. Okay, thank you. I'm going to resist the temptation to ask you about the co-financing arrangements and cap measures, which I'd be fascinated to hear more on, maybe if we've got enough time. But other people have asked things that I should probably put to you. So there's a few questions about the sort of supply chain and, you know, the involvement of food companies and processors and retailers. So Angela in Edinburgh asks, can you say a bit more about what's involved in the policy of developing the supply chain and building sector bridges for promoting plant-based food? Steve Jacobs says, are Danish retailers involved in the activities?
Yeah, that is some good considerations, and actually what the retail sector has been responding is a bit, what is our role in the tripartite agreement? They actually found it a bit difficult to play an important role, because and then, it's basically because a lot of the products that are going to be affected by this tax is the products that are for export, so not at least the Danish retailers. And if we take a company like Arla, which is the biggest dairy company in Denmark, and I think also in Europe almost, since they merged with a German dairy company, they have been, I would say, even more against this deal actually than the farmers organizations themselves, because they do see these problems of they are producing in 7 different countries, and now Denmark is going to have this legislation, so they need to produce in a different way in Denmark compared to other places, and therefore it's not the interoperability between production in different EU member states is not as smooth as it used to be, and they do have their own incentive model. So they said, we have our own private scheme, you don't need to come with your public CO2 tax. So I would say there has been resistance from private sector and this supply chain actors, but in the end they said, okay, we can also use what we have learned from our private schemes and our incentive models to say, like, how does it then match up with a carbon tax, and are we actually in a competitive advantage, because we have already done this. We have already, I don't know if you know, but Arla has this incentive model where they pay farmers for some different activities that they can do on farm that is contributing to their climate target within Arla. So yeah, so that's been some of their responses, but yeah, the retail sector has not been much included, and could be in the kind of follow-up conversation on maybe more, which could go more on what kind of food strategies does this then lead to.
Okay, thank you. Georgie asks, what are the metrics that suggest that food prices will increase, and will that translate to farmers through farm gate prices? She goes on, who holds the evidence base for this? Is it the national government? And who are the intended end users, farmers or leadership groups at the 23 catchment level? If the scheme would reduce overall food production, does Denmark have a policy or objective towards food security, a food security target? So would there be any concern about, undermining domestic self-sufficiency or anything like that?
Yeah, for the prices, the 1% is what the Ministry of Finance have calculated based on a green model that they have developed in CONCITO. The chief economists have also calculated it like a similar effect, a very marginal increase. And the explanation is that since the obligation is placed on the producers, much of the increased price for the mitigation actions will not translate down to the consumers. It's only quite marginal how much it will actually go through the supply chain. So that is kind of the explanation of how this price was calculated. Then on food security, that has not been such a big discussion. It probably links to Denmark exporting quite significant amounts of most animal-based food, and we could discuss it because we are also importing a lot of feed and fertilizers to produce this export, but it's not been mentioned as an issue. And I think for like when there is also inclusion of this, we want to develop plant-based food. There is also this, like, it's not because we are not imagining that there is a demand for food in the future from our domestic demands or also international demands, but we would like to see the demand transition towards more plant-based food, and therefore the money is placed there to help develop that sector further.
I see. There are some questions about sort of compliance and monitoring and data. So somebody asked about, will there be carbon audit tools to measure individual farm emissions? But I think more broadly, you're talking about reduced fertilizer use and things like that. So how would compliance with changed practices be enforced? Will there be lots more inspectors, or how do we know that rules are being followed?
Yeah, that's a good question. And since it's not implemented yet, I wouldn't be able to say how it's going to look like in the future. But for the tax itself, and I know that the Ministry of Taxation is working on like what will that system look like, and we do have a lot of data points already from existing sanitation legislation on like how many livestock units do you have on your farm, and also how much manure do they produce. And so we do have these data points already, so it's about translating them into something you can place the tax on. So for the tax, I believe that there is quite a lot of existing data infrastructure, but it needs to be kind of collected and set up in a system that can then calculate the level of taxation. For the subsidy on reducing fertilizer application, I think it's we do have the synthetic fertilizer registration, so you can in a way see there how much you use, and we have fertilizer audits as well. So I don't think it's going to be too difficult to actually monitor this, and I don't think we need a lot of people going to farmers and checking more often, actually, because there is quite a lot of data flows already.
Okay.
We will also have to see.
Okay. David, I'm just going to see whether you want to come back on anything or ask any particular questions of Simone in the light of what she's had to say in response to questions. But let me just slip in my CAP one. So is this largely co-financed with through CAP measures, or is it something that Denmark has had to put a lot of additional, its own national resource into? Has the balance in CAP financing changed through this, or is it broadly just a more imaginative use of schemes, and measures within the CAP?
The 2021 agriculture deal was about how Denmark wanted to implement the CAP, and that has been revised quite a few times to see, okay, how do we then design schemes to help support the implementation? And there is some, I wouldn't say it's perfect because there is the Denmark has introduced temporary extensification schemes where you're committed to then not produce on your agriculture land, but you can also apply for these on peatlands, and then that actually reduce the incentive to actually take out the peatlands out of production and re-wet them so they produce less emissions. So there are some competing kind of schemes in the CAP, and we see for example with afforestation, there's both afforestation scheme within the CAP but also as national funding, but even though there is two schemes, farmers are not applying for it. It's not yet attractive enough, even though when you look at the prices on land, it should cover the expenses the farmers have. So there are a lot of, it's not just going easy going, and the design of these schemes, whether they're financed on the CAP or national finance, needs to be improved in order to really see that these that it accelerates the uptake. Yes. But I think there's been some kind of novelties. There is also a scheme within the CAP that was a permanent extensification of land, where the farmers then kind of legally committed to extensify land. So you could only have extensive grazing on these areas that was then close to some and nature areas that you wanted to protect as well. So
okay, that's great, thank you. We're right up against the clock, I see, but David, is there anything you want to come in by way of sort of rounding off at the end before I hand over to Elta?
I think just to say that on the CAP point, I suspect Denmark will use quite a lot of national money for this, and the next CAP's not yet agreed. But so I think it's important to say that during the negotiations, the government was willing to put more and more money on the table to keep the farmers on board, as I understand it, and that was quite an important part of the discussion. So it wasn't closed down by a tight preordained budget in the way we might kind of expect in the UK. So that's a feature we might want to just note.
Yeah. Some of the differences in political culture and almost sort of public administration practice are different, I think. Simone, that was fantastic. And David, thanks for your response as well. I'm going to hand over to Elta to round things off, but thank you very much.
Yep, thanks very much, Simone and David, and to everyone in the audience for coming and asking all your great questions. Sorry we couldn't get to them all. There were so many good ones there. So thank you for all of your interest. Thanks to Simone very much for being our speaker today, and for David for offering comments on the potential for this to be an opportunity elsewhere. And if you want to watch this back or share this with your colleagues, we'll be putting the video online in a few days, and we'll email it out to you all as well. So we hope you'll join us for our next webinar and look out for that announcement in the coming weeks. Until then, thank you all for coming. Have a great day. Bye now.